if you don't usually follow national news too closely, you probably know that there has been a lot going on in the federal government recently. There are headlines everywhere about various executive actions, federal legislation, budget negotiations, and Supreme Court cases. It's hard enough to track what's happening related to the policies and issues you care about, let alone figure out how to speak up and get involved. Fortunately, we're joined today by experts who are going to share their own experiences in life and work and break down some of the basics for us. So, welcome to a Flourishing Start podcast. I'm really excited to have all of you as experts on here today. And we'll go ahead and let everyone introduce themselves to each other. And we'll go ahead and let Klarissa take it away.
Hi everyone, my name is Klarissa Reynoso. I'm the Senior Program and Policy Manager for the Youth Justice Team at the National Center for Youth Law. And previously I served as a policy advisor for Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as well as a legislative correspondent for Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Born and raised in the Bay Area, very proud of my 510, and I'm excited to be here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sonja Tonnesen-Casalegno. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them, or anything with love. I live in Oakland, Ohlone land. I've lived here since 2010. I'm not from here. I grew up in Wisconsin in a rural community in the Midwest and lived on the East Coast, came to California to go to law school, fell in love with a Californian. So now we have roots here. We have two babies we were raising in Oakland. And yeah, I'm a civil rights attorney. I've always been an activist for liberation. That's just my core. You know, from a little kid, I was always fighting for justice and fairness, and that's not right on the playground. Talk too much, and so you'll all have to help me with that on a podcast for sure. But I'm just really grateful to be in community with a bunch of amazing, incredible people who are here for community and for solidarity at a time when we need it. And so thank you for having us.
Hi, y'all. My name is Deyci Carrillo López. I am an author, abolitionist, immigrant rights advocate, and just an advocate in general here in Deyci East Oakland. I was born in Guanajuato, Mexico, but I was raised in Deyci East Oakland. So a lot of my work now is focused in doing advocacy work and community work here in Oakland, and just creating safe and thriving spaces for our community, where we can all share the magic that we all hold with each other, in a dream to create, the communities that we actually want to live in. But yeah, it's a little bit about me.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to get this conversation started. So I'll just go ahead and get into it. Klarissa, can you explain briefly how is the federal government structured and what is each branch responsible for?
Yeah, so our federal government, decided by the Constitution way back when, is split into three different parts. So we have our executive branch, our judicial branch, and then our legislative branch. So starting with the executive branch, which I think is kind of where most people are familiar with the federal government, we have our president and our vice president. And their main role is, other than representing us, is implementing and enforcing the laws. So they decide kind of how far a law will go, they clarify them, they can also veto them. And they also decide who their cabinet is. And so the cabinet is when we hear things like the Department of Education, Department of Transportation, and they're the people who lead them, so the secretaries. The last thing the president does is he or she or they decide our Supreme Court justices who serve for life. So it's super important when we vote for president. And that leads us to judicial branch. So the judicial branch is our people when we think of the Supreme Court, federal district courts, and circuit courts of appeals. They decide how we interpret the law and how that's going to apply to kind of our real life scenarios. Again, they serve for life, super important, because after 4 years or 8 years with the president, we're still left with who they appointed to Supreme Court if they had that opportunity. Lastly, we have the legislative branch. So that's where we comes in the House of Representatives and then the Senate. So House of Representatives represents smaller groups of people, kind of you can think your local community, like where you would be able to drive to. And those are representatives who, one, function as your voice in Congress. Two, they do constituent services. And that's going to be really important for today's conversation because a lot of people don't know that they work for you. You hire them when you vote for them. They are not your boss, they work for you. And then Senate, every state has 2 senators, and that was designed so kind of there's, I guess, 2 representatives for each state. They're in the Senate. Some people think they have more power than the House of Representatives. They're supposed to be kind of balancing each other out. All these branches are balancing each other out. Senators serve 6-year terms. Representatives serve 2-year terms, which is going to be important in our conversation today too. And they help us advocate again for ourselves, do constituent services. They're in charge of federal spending. They decide if we go to war, even though sometimes people think it's the president. It's not. They decide appropriations, and they are the ones, I think, for us that are most accessible to keep accountable. So again, we have executive branch, judicial, and legislative.
That was really, really helpful. I feel like I could just have wished to receive that information like when I was a lot younger in my education system.
Yes.
And like those few sentences you just said, and I feel like I would have grasped it a lot more, especially the part where you said like they work for you, not vice versa. I was like, wow, sigh of relief. But can you share a little bit more of like what is federal advocacy generally?
Yeah, so federal advocacy, I often call it kind of like the customer service of our federal government. So federal advocacy is a way for either communities or individuals, that's what it's supposed to be, it's not supposed to be corporations, but communities or individuals' efforts to influence policy. So it's things like calling your congress member, sending notes. Voting can be a form of advocacy, going to offices, protesting. These are all forms of standing up for things that you believe in as a community member, a caregiver, or a parent. And these are all different ways we can interact. So federal advocacy, I'd say in short terms, is just participating and helping influence what your representatives at all levels do and decide on their day-to-day basis in their offices.
Thanks, Clarissa. Now I want to turn it over to Sonja. Like, how did you first get introduced to advocacy? And if you can sort of also touch on what the learning curve was like when you first started.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I kind of think about it like in the formal way that Klarissa was just talking about. How did I learn some of that versus like how did I get involved in advocacy even before I knew nothing, right? Before I didn't know the structure of government. And I think you can still do that even without all of the knowledge of the system. There's still ways to advocate. So I really think about like where did my organizing birth happen, right, in life? And a lot of that was as a child, right? So I was a queer young person with queer friends growing up in the Midwest in a really conservative, very Christian, very white community where that was looked down upon, degraded, had violence against my friends and my community that we experienced from bigotry and from homophobia and transphobia. And so we started organizing. You know, back then we called it Gay Straight Alliance. That was the name a lot of us started community clubs at our schools to have a space with some queer teachers who weren't necessarily out, but who supported us. And so that was a space where I was learning organizing as a middle schooler and a high schooler, right? With my own friends, like, oh, wow, we need a space that is for us and that is safe and where we can advocate for the needs of our community and also to keep us safe, right? To keep us safe. So that was sort of, to me, the birth of where I learned about organizing. When I was in high school, I actually worked on a campaign. It was a proposition in Wisconsin to pass gay marriage and make it legal, because at that time it wasn't legal in the United States in all states. Only some states had legalized gay marriage. And we lost, and I learned a lot from that. It was very heartbreaking, right? Because I worked so hard. I door knocked. I made calls. I was a young person. You know, here I am, how many years later? I don't want to even say, 25 years later, maybe. And we just worked on, you know, Deyci and I worked on this together on Prop 6, trying to end slavery in California. We had young people who activated around that. And I saw myself so much in their eyes because this was something that directly affected them, their communities, their lives, their people. And we fought and we did everything we could and we still lost, right? And yet years later, through lawyers, through litigation, eventually gay marriage was passed at the federal level, right? So I always believe that if we are persistent at these problems and we do it in community and through solidarity, things can change. That doesn't mean there isn't backlash, because we're seeing that right now, but that's kind of where I learned the power of organizing. And even when you feel you have very little or don't have a voice or don't understand all the systems, you still have power and you can still push huge major campaigns. Sometimes they win, sometimes they don't, but a lot of the winning is the solidarity and community. You know, I think now, so many years later, I talk to young people who are in middle school and high school, and they're starting like 50 different clubs around identity, around gender and queerness and justice, and how that intersects with other parts of their identity. And like, we didn't even have the language. So young people have birthed the whole language for our community that older folks, and especially elders in the queer justice movement, didn't have that language and didn't have that access. So it is something that is passed down, and like ancestrally, I think it breeds the movement and grows it over time and improves it over time to have that power. So that's like where I learned about organizing. In terms of where I learned about policy, I would really say it wasn't till law school that I understood how the things I worked on were like connected to a system and deep institutions, and how it was connected to voting and everything, right? I voted in college, so I guess I had a sense of it, in my, late teens, early 20s. It was something that was encouraged by my family, so I credit them for that. But I can't say I still really understood it until I did it myself. And so it was really in law school where I was like, okay, this is how legislation works and coalition building. And I got more involved in that. And then through my work, I worked with currently and formerly incarcerated people after I graduated law school. We came up with ideas together. Hey, this is something we want to change about California law, and created our own coalitions, found people in government, just like Klarissa was talking about, people who represented us, people who had some kind of value alignment or who we could influence, and convince them to bring our ideas. So I think a lot of the bills that actually go through government, which are people deciding like whether or not it's going to become law and changes that might be made in that process, a lot of those ideas actually can come from community and people who are directly impacted by the law we're changing. And we have to find those champions in government to do it alongside us. So that was where I started to learn it. And there were a lot of mentors I had. I didn't learn it on my own. There were Jess Bartholow, who was with Western Center on Law and Poverty at the time, taught me all about how legislation worked at the state level. Mark Philpert, who used to be at Policy Link, who's now leads the Black Freedom Fund in California, taught me about the budget process, how you ask for money, and it's always a no if you don't ask. So I had all these mentors who had been doing it longer, and a lot of them shared the same. They learned it by doing it. It wasn't, like you said, Esme, it wasn't taught in school. It really was barely taught in law school. Like I chose to take a legislation class, but it was definitely not required. And even then, it wasn't like, it was theoretical, right? It wasn't teaching all the practical skills that you need to push things at that level. So a lot of it was just, learned in community and mentors passing on that knowledge. And I'm so grateful. And so I take that seriously, that when younger people or people newer to this game want to learn it, I'm always going to share that knowledge for free and get people involved, because that is how I got to take the things I cared about and move into a different level in terms of my advocacy. So that's what I would say is where I learned a lot about that. And then I also think of advocacy as bigger than policy. Like, part of why I went to law school is because there's like the carrot and the stick idea, right? That you can also use the law to enforce rights. And like, we're seeing that right now, like executive order, executive order, executive order. It's like lawsuit, 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 lawsuit. And if we don't have freedom fighters who are lawyers, then that stuff just goes unchecked. Even if it's illegal, unconstitutional, straight up fascist behavior, it goes, right? Because our government is only as good as we keep it accountable. And so I see the law as just one tool, and not my most important tool, but one of my tools for being able to keep folks accountable. So like, when I was doing a lot of work inside of the state prisons, they tried to ban a legal book, a Know Your Rights book that we created, and we litigated that. We're like, no, this is freedom of speech. This is legal material. People have a right to their own defense. We made all those arguments and we litigated it. So that's another form of advocacy, different from policy, that I think is really important for community to know, like, is a lever that can be pushed, is to get involved in lawsuits. And when we share our struggles, that's how we learn, oh, this is happening to a lot of people, and we have to push back in different ways. So that's kind of how I would say, like, different stages of my life, I learned different ways to advocate.
Wow. I'm feeling very, very inspired. Thank you so much for sharing the part of your journey with us. You are really incredible, Sonja. I just wanted to say that out loud. And I wanted to shift the conversation to Deyci now. Can you share your experience with advocacy and share how you have incorporated artivism into your advocacy journey?
Yeah. Well, for me, like, the journey in doing advocacy and realizing that I have a voice happened out of frustration for why people who knew nothing about my life were able to make decisions about my life. So I found out I was undocumented at the age of 13. And at the time, and still now, I was really angry about like people who are so far out, disconnected from my story, from the life I live, from the life my community lives, how they had so much power to dictate or try to dictate how we lived our life. And it all started then. And then in high school, at the right time, in ninth grade, came a program called Ignite, which it aims to be able to put more women in political office. And they have a whole curriculum that Esmeralda and I actually went through. We taught 11th and 12th grade, the curriculum too. And it was then that I realized, like Clarissa said, like these people work for us, like I think we forget that all the time. We forget that, they're there to answer to us. If we don't like how they're moving, you got to give us an answer. We can show up to their offices. We can call their offices. We can let them know how we're feeling, and we should be letting them know how we're feeling. So that was how I first started getting into advocacy. I remember my first project with Ignite was around an issue that I wanted to fix in Oakland. And that's what first got me thinking of like, you know what, there's alternatives to what exists right now. There's ways to think outside the box of what solutions could look like. And that's one thing that, this system is designed to do, to rob us of our imagination of what a different world could look like. And through my art, through poetry, I've been kind of like pushing that, like, in the spaces that I hold, I've been going to share my poetry with high schools and colleges, universities all over California. In the different stages that I've been at, I really been pushing that, like, like we can re-envision what our communities can look like. And again, what Clarissa said, that they work for us, like reminding people of their power, that even though sometimes we might feel like we don't have any, we have so much power. If we didn't have power, they wouldn't try every day to try to take it away from us, So that's the other thing that, I always tell folks when I'm talking about the way that they can get involved. And it looks like in so many different ways. Like to me, it might look like being out in the community giving red cards. It might be like sharing my art. To other people, it might look a different way. It might be going to a protest. But every angle of advocacy is needed, and there's no one way that will lead us to where we want to get. We need all of those to come together to lead us to where we want to be. But that's a little bit of like how I got into the advocacy world, and just really like the the desire to us all reclaiming our power back in these times that when we might feel very hopeless. We have power, and I want folks to remember that.
I know this is not in the Runner show, but I'm like, Daisy, do you want to share one of your poems with us on this topic? If you happen to have one on the top of your mind, and like, I could definitely leave some space for that at the end. And like, on that part of federal legislation, it moves slowly. That's one thing that we commonly hear. And so sometimes it feels out of reach for people at a local level. So Clarissa, how can parents, community members encourage elected officials to pursue policies that help kids and families?
So I think it's a disclaimer, I do not have my own kids, but I do have lots of nieces and nephews that I help take care of. And I think we all know kids are a full-time job, right? They take up like all of our day and energy and like mindset. And even when you're doing one thing, you're still at the end of the day thinking of your kids or who you're caretaking for. And that's a lot. Like that's a lot as a human. And federal legislation, when it's moving slowly, it can feel either overwhelming, or I think for some people, sometimes it feels uninteresting. Like you're like, oh, it's never going to happen. Or like, oh, this isn't affecting me now. Or it's always been that way, so I'm not even going to push on it. And I think the first place to start when you're trying to keep the movement going and trying to get, or just start the movement and get involved when you wake up one day and you're like, I've had enough, is talking to people. Like talk to your neighbors, go outside and be like, hey, did you see that in the news? What do you think? Talk to people. That's where advocacy starts, right? It starts in the streets. It starts when you're with your neighbor talking. It starts in the grocery store when you turn behind and you're like, these eggs are so expensive, what's going on? It starts with like all these things are the beginning of advocacy, because that's when you start to realize, oh, other people have the same issues I have, or other people have the same fears I have, or other people like maybe the same things that I do. It's all kind of trial and error as we're going through federal policy. So first starting just talking to people. And I think after COVID, a lot of us kind of lost that, or we've maybe forgotten how to just do that. And I think connecting with your community is so key. Also, on that note, is leaning on each other. I think when the times get tough, like it takes a village to raise a kid. It also takes a village to raise a bill, right? Like no one can do it by themselves. You need each other. Like if I'm working on the bill one day, or I'm protesting or calling my Congress members, tomorrow maybe Esme can do it, or my mom can do it the next day. Having that space to lean on each other and know that you don't have to do it all by yourself with these other people that have the same concerns as you. I also think as you're doing it, uplifting each other and making those efforts accessible and inclusive. So knowing that, everyone can get involved, whatever their abilities may be, is such a key part of that. But yeah, like sometimes it is part of legislation. Like it does move slowly. Sometimes that's good because we want to be careful with what we move forward. And sometimes when it moves fast, that's when you really should be concerned, because they're moving fast for a reason. They don't want you to notice. They want you to slide through the bill. They want it to happen quick so you don't even have time to talk to your neighbor about it. And that's why it's so important to talk to your neighbor, talk to your community members, find ways for you to stay updated that is accessible and feasible for you. Like if you're working with your kids all day long and you only have 3 minutes to consume news, find something that's 3 minutes, whether it's like the daily podcast, which is a little bit longer, like NPR's morning, I think it's 15 minutes. Like the small things like that can help you. But I think in terms of pursuing policies that are going to help kids and families is kind of knowing, like for me, sometimes what helps me is thinking of as like a vision board. Like what are my concerns? Like what do I actually look at when I think of my government? What do I want them to do for me? Because at the end of the day, like we keep saying, they work for you, right? So you're making kind of like this job post for the year. Like what do I want them to do this year? What are my goals for them? And how am I going to do that? Whether that's maybe smaller things, or if you have access and the ability and the privilege at a higher level, maybe you work in Congress or something, you have access to those, but trying to figuring out like what are the tools that I have to make meaningful change, and giving yourself grace that, again, you can't just do it by yourself. Like you cannot, just you walking down the street yelling like, I want this to happen, maybe won't work. But if you get your neighbor, your family, your sisters, your kids, then people start looking. And I think knowing that sometimes it takes a little time, and being impatient is also part of it. Like don't just sit and wait, like act and lean on each other, and know that sometimes you need to take a little rest. But then when we lean on each other, other people are going to be there to help pick up the pace too.
Thank you for sharing that, Clarissa. I want to go to Sonja back again. When you were starting off in your advocacy journey, what tools were most helpful and useful in your learning process that you think would be helpful for other parents to use when they're first starting out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of it, I think, for me was through mentorship. Honestly, it was through being connected to people who have made advocacy their life's work, because they also have a little bit more like spaciousness to be able to focus on it. If it's your 9 to 5, if it's paying your bills, if it's the thing giving you stability, is actually your advocacy work. A lot of people in those roles, whether it's nonprofit or government or working for a legislator, people who have that time and spaciousness often like are able to take on some mentorship in that, right? And then also just like being involved in movement work. So if you see students who are organizing, if you see, religious group is organizing, immigrants are organizing, protests are happening, like you can get connected to so many activists and powerful people from those spaces and not even realize like, oh, there's actually an infrastructure, right? Like when I became a parent, it was like, oh, there's an abolitionist caregivers group that's happening. Oh, there's this a group of trying to be more like tender with our childbearing practices in my neighborhood that's happening. And none of this is official. None of this is 501c3, 501c anything, right? Like this is all just people coming together and wanting to improve how we show up for each other, our community, our neighborhoods, all of that. But it does, like I think you said, like it does require putting yourself out there, which can be like, I can seem extroverted, but I can be very awkward with social interactions. So it can be really hard to be like, oh, I'm just going to tell you, here's what I'm struggling with. Here's what's going on for me. And I'm going through that in my life right now, right? Like I've shared some of that with you, Esme, when we met recently, like, and that's how this happened, right? Because I shared a little bit of my story. I was like, I was recently laid off. I have a baby. I have a small child. I'm now facing an eviction in my home. I hopefully don't get emotional. But when I actually talk about that, so many people show up, so many people make space. And so my big learning from that, or my big sharing from that, is like some of us can be very prideful, and it's so hard to humble ourselves to accept help, even though we've been generous our whole lives and always tried to give that to others. So sometimes it's about, as a parent, being like, I got to be strong for my kids, but with my community and my peers, I can need help, and I can let people know this is hard, and they show up for you big time. So sorry, I'm crying a bit, but it's very real. And I think that takes so much. And I think about that right now, like with the protests that we were seeing, right, for the day without immigrants, where people did no working, no shopping. What was the other one? No work, no shopping. Help me out. Someone, the third piece.
School.
No school. Thank you. Right? Like that's actually very brave and vulnerable for people to show up in that way and to make real risks to their livelihood. But look how much support came out. Look at how people say, no, I have a fund. I'm going to pay so that you can skip work that day so you can come to the protest with me. Like people will really show up for you in that way. And sometimes it's in small conversations. It's not big public forms of advocacy. But that's something I've learned is when I humble myself during hard times, organizing happens, politicizing happens, radicalization happens in the right ways, out of love and out of care and out of community and out of solidarity. So I'm definitely in that space in my life right now, and it's the reason I do what I do.
My heart goes out with you so big, Sonja. I am very happy that we're in this space as community because, like, I think Deyci posted recently a quote, maybe by Bell Hooks, I'm not too sure, but I think is healing happens in community. And I think, like, that's so powerful. And, like, that's why I'm very thankful for the space today. And we're going to be here together for a while. So I look forward to future opportunities to meet in person and even just continue to talk about these conversations because there really is power in community. And thank you for sharing what you have shared with us so far.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking as you were talking is like for folks who are not parents, realizing that that's such a central part of a life for someone, if they're a caregiver, could be a grandparent, a parent, whatever, but taking care of a little person, that is a full-time job. That's a double full-time job, really. To be totally honest, it's like a lot of sleeplessness, being woken up in the middle of the night because someone had an accident, someone needs a water, someone needs to breastfeed, someone needs help. So you're constantly giving, giving, giving. So I think part of movement work too is we have devalued caregiving. So people who are able to offer that, hey, I'm going to watch your kids so you can go to this protest, so you can call your congressperson. I'm going to come to your house and clean it so that you can actually take care of your children for a second. Like I've also found that we have devalued that so greatly as a culture. We don't monetize it, so therefore it doesn't matter. But in fact, like caregiving is what has made all of us thrive and exist in this world. So like for any parent, caregiver, grandparent, foster parent, adoptive parent out there, like they are doing incredibly hard work. And when we're in the position to support them or take a little burden off, it can be really simple. I think it gives them the ability to get more politically activated. Because I see a lot of parents kind of fall back because there's just so much pulling at them. And that's especially when you have really little kids, like under 10, so much pulling at you in that stage of life that like people kind of are like, oh, I'm not able to go to the protest, or I'm not able to make the calls. Da, da, da. So I think that's a way that we can sort of do some sharing of care to make it possible for more caregivers to actually show up in politicized spaces.
I just wanted to open it up to Deyci or Klarissa. Do y'all want to chime in on this part of the conversation? I know Sonja's our only parent on the call right now, and so as non-parents but still caregivers to little ones, has anything resonated with y'all or any comments that y'all want to share?
I think do you want to go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay. I think my only thing that I want to really, I guess, like push on is when you are doing advocacy, whether you are a parent or a caregiver or like a neighbor of a child, like we are all connected to a child in some capacity. Like every adult in this whole world interacts with children. And children are watching us at all times. Like when we're sleeping, they're watching us. When we are brushing their teeth, at least my nieces are like they're not here right now, but when they're with me, their eyes are glued. And when they do stuff, sometimes I'm like, dang, it's because they saw me do it, and that's why they're doing it. But that goes for advocacy too, right? Like when you advocate for things, even if it's not maybe child appropriate in terms of like the level of what maybe you're advocating for, whether it be a range of things in the news. Not all things are maybe things that like a 5-year-old needs to know in deep depth, but like find a way to talk to kids about it and include them and talk to them and also listen to them. Like my niece, I was telling her, I just started this job for all of, like, I guess a little background in December. And she was asking me one day, she was doing homework, and she was like, what do you do? Like, what's your job? And I was like, oh my God, great question. And I was showing her, she's 10, so she's like kind of sassy, but she was like, okay, so like, let me get this straight. Like, this is what you're doing. And you like do that all day? Like, you don't like change classes? Because she's 10. And I was like, no, this is what I do. And she's like, well, why? And I was telling her why. And she's like, so can I do that? And I was like, heck yeah, you can, like, for sure. Or like when I worked in Congress, they'd always be like, can I run for Congress? I'm like, yeah, you can. Like, yes, you can. And you can also call your Congress member. They are your representative. Like, so I think those things go far, because when you teach your kids how to be advocates, then they aren't in the situation where they're an adult and they don't know what to do. They can spread that knowledge, right? That's the key, is spreading that knowledge. And so I think planting those seeds early in your kids and knowing that that's an option provides the future generations with so much power, because sometimes, like we kind of talked about, there are government systems that are trying to hide the fact that they work for you. They're trying to make you think that you're little, and you're not. At the end of the day, we're hiring them, and the kids are too, whoever they be, because at the end of the day, representatives represent all of us that's included in the census, including undocumented immigrants. Like they are part of that census count. Representatives represent all of us, and every child, adult, every age has the right to advocate for themselves. So I think that's the one thing I want to harp on, is like, talk to your kids about what you're doing. Talk to them about why things are important. Like, I will always remember the day my grandpa took me to a protest in like 2001. And I was like, really small at the time, about like, I think it was after Barbara Lee voted her famous vote for AMF, but he took me there and he explained it to me in very basic terms. And that stuck with me. That was like one of my like moments that was like, you know what? I want to be involved. I want to know what's up. And now it was kind of came full circle. But I think that would be the one thing, is include your kids, talk to them, explain things, and listen to them, answer their questions as much as you possibly can in the moment, or maybe save it for later. But yeah, they want to learn too.
Yeah, I echo everything everybody said. And I think the only thing that I will add is that don't be afraid to start something that doesn't already exist. I think a lot of us sometimes hold back when we're like, oh, but there's nothing like that out there. Maybe you're the person who's meant to create it for it to exist, Maybe that's why you got the idea. And bring more people who you trust in your community, who will also feel the same way, to like come and continue to build off of that. So just, encouraging people to like, sometimes it's you're not going to do nothing by yourself. Like sometimes it might feel like you might not be able to do anything by yourself. But like when you put that idea out there, you plant the seed, there's the elements work all together, the soil, the sun, the water, and all of those elements are the other people in your community that help that idea grow. So just wanted to, say that, sometimes it takes one person to do it for the rest to, follow.
Deyci, I'm going to keep the mic with you. Starting off in your advocacy journey, what was a tool that was useful for you in your learning process that possibly other parents or community members can use when they're first starting out?
I would say when I was handed a mic, when you give the youth the opportunity to say what they're thinking on a mic, I think that gives back the power to the youth and lets them know, what they gotta say matters. And I think that's a lot that sometimes is not happening in movement spaces. We're not giving youth the opportunity to really take the mic. And that's something we also got to be careful of. We got leaders in spaces who, have been leading for a long time. And when you're a good leader, you got to put the next leader on. So I think like for me, it was like being able to be given the mic and the trusted that I could hold that mic. And so I invite anyone else in movement spaces to give that youth the mic and let them, to use it and take it and run with it and trust them that, they know what they got to say on that mic. Yeah.
Shout out the mics that are passed to people and young people, children, all of them. Clarissa, you mentioned in the beginning that you worked for many years in representatives' offices. Do you have any stories that you'd like to share about parents coming into the office to advocate on behalf of young children and families, or maybe even receiving calls, letters from parents? Did their outreach actually make a difference?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I feel like actually the most calls and visits we got were from parents, which is, like people think that they are not coming to Congress. They totally are. People fly in, people walk, people bus, people drive to advocate for their kids. Because as you all know, like we would do anything for our kid, right? And so, yes, totally. In both offices, Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Representative Lee, I saw lots of families come in. I also saw lots of kids come in on their own, like high school students do walkouts and come to our office. And I think those are both, important, because I think a lot of those kids came because their parents, as you were saying, Deyci, like they empowered them, or their local community empowered them. Something that really sticks with me is after the 2016 election, I had this family come in from Oakland into Farley's office. I just started working there. And it was this mom and dad who were super just like funky. I love them. And they have these two little girls, and they were going to visit the Capitol. And they had their daughters write out a list of things they wanted to see changed in Congress. Their daughters were 5 and 7. And I wish I had them today, but I couldn't find them in my notes. But they're these little notes, like very simple with crayon. And the mom walked in and shared the stories of the kids, told me, what they needed at their schools, what they needed in their communities, and they gave me their letters. And I kept those letters on my desk in both offices the entire time I worked on the Hill. Like they were always my like little reminders of these, like little humans that have these big ideas, because they were really, kids at the end of the day have, I think, so much compassion for people that we sometimes lose as we get into adulthood. When you ask them about laws, sometimes their ideas are so basic and amazing. Like it's like everyone should have access to food. Yes, like yes, you are so right. But anyways, this family to me was so impactful because she stayed there for like an hour. Like she waited. Like she was like, I'm gonna wait until the congresswoman walks in. And I was like, okay, cool. And we talked and we chatted. And she got her 5 minutes with the congressmember as she was going from one to another. And the congressmember remembered her and remembered their story. And it definitely influenced the bills that we were moving through appropriations that year, things that those families needed in our district. I also think a lot about like Foster Youth Day, which we did a lot of work with. And also March for Our Lives, where these people came in and shared a lot of their stories. And one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is Congress members can also submit things to the congressional record, which is like a stamp in the congressional record of your story. And that's a really powerful thing of working with your Congress member to do that, if you can get your story into the congressional records. And so, I think their visits made a huge difference. If you can't go all the way to DC, like that's really not accessible for most people at all. One thing that I think a lot of people also don't know is every representative has a district office that is supposed to be within a certain range of all constituents. Like it's in your district, whether it be downtown or they have like a satellite office that's a little bit closer to you. And you can go there and you can still submit federal complaints. You can also get help through the constituent services for casework. Like I always tell people, even if you think they can't help with it, ask, go in and be like, I need help, like help me, because that's what they're there for, right? And we saw that a lot, parents going in for things like, my kid is getting expelled from school, I don't know what to do, help. Or like my kids' teachers are not helping them with like their, whatever it be, whether, need help with school or help with after school programs, help. My housing situation, I need help. My medical care, I need help. There are things that they can help you with that are so not talked about. And for me, it's so annoying because I'm like, the only reason I know this is because I worked in Congress. If I didn't work there, I would not know it. And so these families, I kind of went off topic, but yes, the visiting your Congress members, it is so important. And not just on behalf of the young children, but bringing them in is also so key. And it does make huge differences. Representative Ocasio-Cortez was so big on like face-to-face interactions for advocacy. Like she's a community leader at heart. And that was something that I really loved about that office is we like went into the district and talked to people, and that really changed what we did. Like it really changed because when you're face-to-face with someone and they're telling you that something's affecting your life, like that sticks with you, whether like you want it to or not, like it's gonna stick with them. So like go to those offices, make those phone calls, go to the district office, go to town halls. Like it is so, so, so important.
So this is the part in the podcast where you all can ask each other questions. This is honestly my favorite part. I didn't want to make it such a big deal to y'all, but I love this portion of the podcast. So I'm going to go off mute. The awkward silence is totally fine with me, but I'm going to give at least 5 minutes of just for y'all to think about anything y'all would like to ask each other. So I'll go ahead and go off mute, and just feel free to hop off and direct your questions where needed.
I guess I do have a question for Deyci. I'm like so curious. You do so much work in like artivism, community. Yeah, you just like your story so far is like amazing. And I'm just curious. I feel like one thing I've been struggling with, particularly this month, is managing my fear along with still continuing my advocacy, like not letting my fear or panic get in the way. And I think when I worked on the Hill, that was something that I felt more in control of because I was like there and I was able to be like, I don't like this, I'm gonna write appropriations amendment. Or I don't like this, I'm gonna like try to get us to tweet about it. And I still acknowledge that I'm in this position of like such privilege where I work that I have influence on children's rights and being able to advocate for them. But I'm curious from your standpoint as such like a community leader and someone that's able to talk to people in such a like empathetic and connective way, what's your advice for, I guess, parents or just caregivers in managing their fear and not being overwhelmed by fear and turning it into like real advocacy, like not shutting down from the fear, but turning it into like action instead?
That's a good question because I get scared too, you know. Sometimes I'm like, am I being too bold on social media? And it's actually been something that's come up multiple times the last couple of months. Because we do know, you know, ICE monitors people's social media. We do know ICE is very petty. I used to work as an immigration paralegal with people who were detained in immigration custody and also people who are non-detained. So was able to see, you know, that side, and it's it's very how would I say it? It's okay to feel those feelings of it's okay to feel fear. But the thing that I always remember is that fear is just a feeling, you know, fear can't kill us. And I think at the end of the day, for me, because also my family is also feeling the same things, you know. What I try to tell my mom is like, to me, is like, I'm not gonna let them win. Like, you know, that's how they want us to feel. They want us to feel fear. So to me, it's like I'm not gonna let them win. Like I'm gonna lean into my joy. I'm gonna lean into creating spaces for community. I'm gonna lean into showing up for my community, for each other in different ways that are popping up right now. So I would say right now for people who, you know, have privileges, you know, being that ally, like being that ally, and if you know somebody who is in a situation where like they don't feel comfortable, show up for them and be there with them, maybe to go to a conference. For example, I'll be speaking at a conference this weekend. I know it's for just youth, you and docu youth, you know. I know a lot of people are feeling a lot of anxiety about coming, and so I'm like, be an ally and come with the youth, you know, to make them feel more at ease, to make them feel like they got somebody to back them up. So I think right now, remembering that, you know, even though we might all be feeling fear, like you're not alone in that fear, like everybody's feeling it, but we got to turn that fear into power, and that means showing up for each other. So yeah, I think that's what I would say. Hopefully that was helpful.
No, it was. Thank you.
I think I have a question for you, Sonja. I know Clarissa talked a little bit about this, about how, you know, kids understand, you know, there's a way to explain things to kids for them to, like, you know, get a sense of what's going on and what's right and what's wrong. I would, you know, like to hear a little bit about you and how that has been as a parent, you know, being in a movement for so long, I know I've seen you bring out your little ones to, to actions, to spaces, to community spaces. So I just wanted to, learn a little bit about how you approach that, and, how you break it down, to your little ones about what's going on, or, even like explaining why you're going to a protest, why you're going to a certain community meeting. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I would say like one of my fundamental beliefs is that if a child can experience it, then my child can at the very least learn about it. So I don't have this strong sense that there is like any topic that's off limit with my kids. How I might talk about it might change, and I know it will change as they get older and can understand things, right? Like I have a 3-year-old and a 10-month-old. So I think in a lot of ways I'm communicating about it by taking them with me. If I feel like it's a space that can be safe, and maybe there's other families there, a lot of times checking, are there going to be other families there? Is there going to be a kid-friendly space there? Is there going to be art, things that can keep them there? But, while they're eating their snack and coloring, they're listening to speakers, they're listening to artists, they're hearing poetry, they're being exposed. So I think so much of it comes from that exposure and being in community that I really value. And then a lot of it is, yeah, just trying to talk about it in really simple terms, right? Like, even like being mindful of where I'm sending them to school every day, right? Like my daughter goes to a school where they talk about race, they talk about gender, they talk about pronouns. It's a Spanish school, and so they use gender inclusive language even in Spanish, right? So like those kinds of things, I'm really mindful who's taking care of my child, how are they incorporating that into the things they're talking about. And then talking about it a lot at home and sort of explaining things to them, in really, really simple terms, right? Like, but I just don't think there's anything that's off topic, right? And also trying to explain feelings, like you were saying, like how people might be feeling right now, and trying to teach compassion. Like the same way we will care for someone if they fall and get hurt, we also have to care for our hearts and our emotions and our feelings. And sometimes that's just listening to someone or being there for them. Or so I'm trying to model that too. Like if my kid is really sad or angry or fearful, I don't try to suppress the emotion. I say, let it out. I'm here for you. You're safe with me. Tell me more. I want to hear more. Why are you feeling like that? I try to like bring it out of them. And not just because I want that for them, but I want them to do that for others. And I want them to role model that. So yeah, I think a lot of it at this little age is mostly about exposure and talking about it in things that maybe they can relate to their own life. But I wasn't shielded as a child. I kind of joke that like I had, my dad, like his reading to me at nighttime would be like Time magazine or like some like deep ass historical book, you know what I mean, about, reading about the civil rights movement. And, my parents are the products of like the 50s and 60s. So that was a lot of their politicization, right? Was seeing that. And so like they just didn't hide that from me. They talked about it. I come from a white family. My dad was raised by a single mom in Chicago, and he would say, I saw Martin Luther King Jr. march. And I heard him on the news talk about it was the worst racism he ever experienced, because in the South, the racism was out and people were honest about it. But in Chicago, you were not supposed to be racist. So it was so deep seated that it came out in more violent, more rageful ways when people were marching the street, peacefully protesting, right? So like they just told me those stories. They were very honest about it. And I think it helped me so much because I did grow up in such a little town, a rural space, very Christian, very homogenous, very white, to like understand things beyond just my experience, but also to connect my humanity to things I might be struggling with and how that connected to other people. So I credit my parents a whole lot for talking to me and sharing those things to me and exposing me, introducing me to people who had different perspectives on life. And it just gave me a very different worldview, so that when I was kind of thrown out into the world, no longer a child in that way, like nothing was shocking to me because I had already been prepared for that and exposed to that. It wasn't overwhelming to me. In that way, I guess. So yeah, but that's just my feeling is like if some kid is experiencing it, like we see what's happening in Gaza, right? Like so many children have been killed, they have lost limbs, they are suffering. Like, am I going to have my child watching horrific, violent things on social media or television? No, I don't feel comfortable with that, with them visualizing it like that. I think that would be too scary. But I will talk about how, hey, we live in a place where we have a lot of power being in the United States, in this country, and it's not being used for the benefit of other people. It's hurting other people. So even though we're taught to value a lot of things in this country, we're not living by those values. And like we might talk about, how is that something that we can see in our everyday life? Like we say we're going to be compassionate and caring, but then you punch your brother? No, like we don't want to do that. We don't want to use our power over someone smaller or someone who needs our help. So I try to like make comparisons to things in her life to try to teach that. I don't know how much she's getting it now, but I just feel like if I continue to talk and continue to expose that, eventually she'll, hopefully be one of those kids walking out of school, going to their congressperson's office and demanding for their shit, excuse my language, there's probably kids listening, demanding for their stuff, because they really, they have so much power as young people, and they do see the world in a much different way. And I just want to make her feel like she has that intrinsically, that power to do something about it.
And on that note, power to the youth, power to the children. I'll close out with the first step that a listener could take to get engaged. One thing that you can do is just look up the name of your representative. In the show notes, we'll have a link to where you can put in your address and you can find out who your representative is. And also maybe spend some time thinking about what is an issue that you care about and that you want to learn more about. I'll put that action in your mind so that you all can think about that a little bit more. But with that, thank you so much, Deyci, Klarissa, Sonja. It was such a wonderful time to host y'all together. And thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us today on our podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the National Center for Youth Law. To suggest a podcast topic or to express interest in being a podcast guest, please email health@youthlaw.org.